Hello and welcome to India's World. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government in Japan has authorized the reinterpretation of the country's pacifist and defensive military posture. Article 9 of the Japanese constitution renounces war and prevents Japan from sending its armed forces to a foreign country. The cabinet decision, which still needs changes to relevant laws, paves the way for Japan's self-defense forces to engage in military operations overseas to defend Japan's allies, even if Japan itself is not under attack. In other words, it allows Japan to take part in conflicts abroad, potentially putting Japanese soldiers in harm's way. The opposition to the move runs high in Japan, although opinion is divided. China and South Korea are likely to see it as the resurgence of Japanese militarism. To discuss what the change in Japan's defensive posture could mean, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts. Ambassador T.C. Rangachari, a former diplomat specialist in China and East Asia. He was India's ambassador to France and Germany. We have Professor Brij Tankha. He was professor of modern Japanese studies, in Delhi University and is currently a fellow at Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. And we have Dr. C. Rajamohan, one of our foremost commentators on foreign policy, a well-known journalist and currently a distinguished fellow at Observer Research Foundation, a think tank in Delhi. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Raj, let me begin with you. What has prompted Shinzo Abe to reinterpret Article 9 of the Constitution?
I think this has been coming for a while, though the headline is somewhat screaming, I think the sense is, look, this is not the first time Japan has reinterpreted Article 9 of the Constitution. Professor Tankha, I'm sure, will have more to say on this. Look, I think every time the external circumstance changes, all countries have to react to the external circumstance. And I think in the last 3-4 years, I think Japan has been moving away from a passive defense posture to one seeking to strengthen its military, to be able to partake in operations with its allies, set up a National Security Council. And what has tilted finally, I think, the complex politics in Japan is the rise of China and China's assertiveness, which I think is shaking all of China's neighbors. So I think we are at so in terms of its significance, though it is not a single step, what's happening in Japan today is a response to the rise of China and China's assertion. And I think this is the beginning of a process of redoing the balance of power in Asia.
Okay. Professor Tankha, Japan's pacifism rested on 3 pillars. One was the prevailing consciousness of victimhood, because they were the only victims of nuclear war. The introduction of a post-war education system, which abhorred and discouraged militarism. And third, popular support for peace movements in Japan. So have all the 3 pillars of pacifism actually eroded?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think I would understand what is happening in a slightly different way. I think Article 9 is a very strange article. It was imposed on the Japanese through the American designed constitution. But along with it was the American military alliance. So you had a strange situation where, on the one hand, America is saying, okay, you've been militarist, you were expansionist, so we'll end this by making you a pacifist nation, you renounce war. But on the other hand, they made them an integral part of a military alliance. The opposition in Japan saw this as an opportunity to limit Japan's rearmament, if you will. However, it depoliticized it. So very little was done to break the American alliance. I mean, there were major movements, but they failed. So what you have is a very strange situation where it is an integral member of an alliance. It has participated in various military exercises. It has gradually, as Raj was pointing to, reinterpreted various aspects from a purely defense force. It's gone through all sorts of changes where they're one of the largest armies in the world, well-trained, well-armed. And they probably have nuclear potential as well.
And there's popular support for this?
No. That's what I'm saying. Here's the problem with this current reinterpretation is the way it's done. It is not done through Parliament, 13 days of discussion, through an advisory committee. It's a...
13 hours, actually.
Sorry, 13 hours. 13 hours. So that is the problem, I think. And it has, at least a majority of the population seem to be opposed to it.
Okay. Let me take this question to Ranga. Ranga, why do you think Shinzo Abe resorted to reinterpretation rather than amendment of the Constitution? And as Professor Tankha was pointing out, 13 hours of discussion internal to the Liberal Democratic Party and to New Kamito, the coalition partner. And recommendation for this comes actually from a committee appointed by the Prime Minister, which has no legal legitimacy.
Well, if you look at history, On the 50th anniversary of the conclusion of the Second World War, Chancellor Kohl in Germany declared that Germany from now would be a quote-unquote normal nation. Japan has been striving to have the same status of being a normal nation, but for a variety of reasons, including the fact that Japan's pre-war history has not been accepted by the neighbors. Unlike in the case of Germany, where France reconciled, Europe reconciled, Germany was brought into the NATO as part of the anti-Soviet alliance and so on. Germany was able to become a normal nation, and Japan has still not succeeded in getting that kind of endorsement in the region that would enable it to become a normal nation. In any country, it would be considered normal for a country to have the right to defend itself on its own strength and not be dependent on an alliance system which may or may not work. Again, if I take a parallel of Europe, the Europeans were always skeptical about, when it came to the crunch, whether the Americans would come to the rescue of Europe if it threatened the existence of the United States or it meant major threat to the United States.
In the case of Japan, the self-defense forces were capable of defending Japan if Japan was directly attacked. The reinterpretation has got to do with defending allies.
True. This is, I think, to my mind, this should be seen as a first step towards that goal of becoming, what I said, quote-unquote, a normal nation, so that you would not only be able to defend yourself, but also participate, if necessary, in other operations, so to speak. Now, if I might very quickly point out, the Japanese have sent their soldiers abroad.
Absolutely.
Not in fighting capacities, but in medical and other capacities. So and now their navy has been participating in anti-piracy exercises, etc. So it's not as if Japanese have till date not had a single soldier outside of Japan.
They have not fought wars outside. That's what I said, and that's what I think the Japanese also understand. That will change now. But let me ask you this. To change that, you have to change certain laws. The self-defense law, for example, the Coast Guard law, if you want to send your Navy and Coast Guard abroad. And an extraordinary session of the Japanese Parliament, the Diet, has been called in I think, this fall. Do you think it's going to be easy passing these bills through Parliament?
No, if you look at the past, for instance, when Japan sent forces through the UN in peacekeeping operations, but they were not involved in any conflict, there was opposition to that. There were problems with that. So I don't think at least the Japanese public is ready to change the laws. Now you can debate, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's a different issue. But as far as the public opinion goes, I think it's very much against for a variety of reasons.
So there might be problems in Parliament?
I certainly think so.
Okay, all right.
His ratings have plummeted. The Cabinet's rating fell by 4 or 5% on this issue.
Okay. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the changes in Japan's defensive posture. Raj, you had pointed to changes taking place in the region. So to what extent is this action actually warranted by looming regional security threats, the missile program of North Korea, Chinese resurgence in terms of territorial claims, etc.? So do you think it's because of this that Abe has sought reinterpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution because it's critical to maintain Japan's influence in East Asia as well as internationally?
Look, I think if it was done 10 years ago, there would have been much less support. And I think the rise of China, the Chinese assertion, I think North Korea is not a serious threat. I mean, North Korea is an excuse. Because you didn't want to mention China, so you were always referring to North Korea. My sense is actually, as China and South Korea get together, maybe Japan will try and reach out to North Korea as well. So I think the problem is China. I think the assumption everyone had made that, look, China's rise will be peaceful, China will be like a giant Switzerland, only interested in making money. So therefore, we're in a happy family, we'll all grow together. What's happened in the last 3-4 years is that Chinese assertion on the territorial disputes and the determination to push through its claims in East China Sea, in South China Sea, I think has fundamentally altered the security environment in the region. And I believe the Japanese people, there's a lot of kabuki around Article 9, pacifism, etc. But I don't think Japanese people have a suicide pact with themselves. There are certain conditions under which certain positions have to be taken. But today, as external circumstances change, I think both because China has become strong and America has become weak, they need to do more for their own security. And I think that's where they're headed.
Okay. Brij, Japan's relationship with its immediate neighbors, South Korea, China, has not been highly cordial. So do you think that's a reinterpretation of this Article 9 coming as it does after Abe's visit to the the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors the war dead, including war criminals, the question of comfort women, actually makes Japanese position seem more hawkish, and it may lead to a deterioration in its ties with these countries rather than balancing them in any way?
One, I think the problems of the rise of China are exaggerated, I think. Two, I think Abe has increased the tensions. So it's not that Japan has always been like this, or the Japan-China relations. There have been contentions and there will be contentions. That's true. But Abe has thrown oil into the fire. And I think this is a further aggravation. I think there are other ways of both achieving independence to defend yourself, an independent defense position, as well as helping to or working to reduce tensions, which he hasn't. He has even created problems with South Korea. For instance, if he had worked a little better closely with South Korea and China, particularly over the history issues, which was easy to do, he needs to appeal to a small constituency of conservative, and this is a whole economic issues behind it and their rise. So by going to Yasukuni, he overturned what the Japanese government had already done, apologized, and the matter could have been closed. It could have been,
swept under the carpet. Yeah.
Well, not swept under the carpet. I think the compensation issue is still there. But, Murayama and others had apologized. He needn't have opened that.
So he's made things worse.
He's made things worse, and he's done it in a fashion which has created more problems within the country.
Okay. Mr. Rangachari, while China and South Korea have criticized the Abe government's reinterpretation of Article 9 and said this doesn't have popular support, that if anything has to be changed, it has to be done by the people of that country, trying to make a distinction between the government representing, as he says, a conservative view and the populace, as it were, representing a sort of a more a view of peaceful coexistence. But US has welcomed it. And do you think US has welcomed it because they want Japan to share part of the burden as their own defense budgets go down?
Well, there are two aspects to this. First of all, insofar as China and South Korea are concerned, I think we have to separate the reactions of the Chinese and South Koreans. The South Korean historical experience has been such that there is a ingrained generic almost feeling in regard to Japan and Japanese militarism. Chinese have conveniently trotted it out whenever it suited them. They have ignored it when it suited them, and they have brought it to the fore. They have mobilized people on the streets, they have written articles in the press, they have given very, very strong statements, and so on. So in that sense, to follow up on what Professor Tankha was saying, it didn't matter, or it doesn't matter whether it is Abe who did it. Almost any prime minister who would have done it, any government would have done it, you would have had the same hostile reaction from the Chinese. Insofar as the Americans are concerned, and burden sharing, actually burden sharing has been going on for a very long time. Almost all of the American troops stationed in Japan today are paid for by the Japanese themselves. The portion that the Americans pay is very small, and it is of the kind of burdens which the Japanese themselves are not willing to accept. And on the question of China and on the question of defense budget, currently, you see, the defense budget has been marginally increased. I think it is 123.97 trillion yen, not dollars or euros, but yen. The Chinese military budget is bigger than Japanese and Indian military budgets put together. It's second only to that of the United States. So therefore, we have to keep this in perspective. When we talk in terms of increase in Japanese budget or increase the kind of burden sharing, etc., that the Japanese might be doing.
Okay, Brij, do you think what has happened in Japan will impact the reinterpretation of the guidelines of the US-Japan defense agreement, which are due for revision by the end of this year?
Well, I'm not really been following this, but I think part of the changes that the Abe government has been making in the secrecy laws and so forth have been in consultation, even under American pressure. The Americans have wanted them to change some of these laws. So I think part of the reinterpretation of Article 9 in this to allow for collective defense is really within the American alliance, is going to work within that. I think Abe also has a separate agenda, which is perhaps to assert or at least create an autonomous force. I don't think it will succeed quite in this fashion, but I think that is a separate agenda which we need to think about.
All right. Raj, do you see Japan playing a bigger role in regional contingencies, say in the Korean Peninsula, that is defending American warships in the region, or even intercepting missiles that are targeting the US?
I think what is the shift is really from a passive posture to an active posture.
Yeah.
To fund American military presence, to write checks for American operations. And I think it was quite convenient for Japan in the first decades after the war, where they didn't want to take too active a role on the military side, concentrate on their economic development. But I think now they're moving from that posture to one of more active contribution to regional defense.
Can they refuse, for example, the request of US military to assist them in international conflicts?
Look, I think, no, the purpose is actually, look, you need the American alliance to cope with China's rise and to participate.
But in other parts of the world, suppose...
Exactly, no, even say, for example, they're already taking a big role in Southeast Asia. When Vietnam and Philippines, who formerly occupied by Japan, today are so frightened by Chinese, they're looking for support, military support from Japan, and Japan is giving it to them. So in ASEAN, already there is an expanded Japanese role.
Outside Southeast and East Asia, do you see them aiding Brij, US military in conflicts elsewhere in the world?
At the moment, that looks a little difficult. I think...
Can they do it unilaterally? Can they refuse it? Now that Article 9 says that you'll have to come to the defensive allies, under certain conditions?
Well, I'm sure that this can be reinterpreted at that stage. There can be other reasons brought in, but perhaps the immediate advantage for the Japanese, at least, is that they can get the Americans to intervene on their behalf. Okay. I think that's maybe Abe's calculation, or at least the threat of American
and not the other way around.
Not the other way around at the moment.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Brij. We need to take a break at this point again. We'll be back again in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing changes in Japan's defensive posture. Ambassador Rangachari, do you think one of the underlying factors pushing Japan away from its pacifist principles is the deeper concern of American decline? I say this because Yosuke Isozaki, a security advisor to Abe at a conference, said, and I quote, "Truth be told, the US can no longer afford to play the world's policeman. This is no longer an era when Japan is permitted to do nothing and count on America to protect it. It's become extremely important we do our own share along with the US." Another person, Secretary General of Abe's Liberal Democratic Party, Shigeru Ishiba, he said at the same conference, I quote, "China's defense spending will continue," what you were pointing out earlier, "China's defense spending will continue its double-digit growth, enhancing its relative strength and reducing America's power." So this fear of American power internationally reducing, declining, and a stage coming, not a burden sharing, but of defending yourself.
Well, maybe three things. First of all, in so far as pacifism is concerned, it is very, very unusual for a country to be pacific when it comes to defending its own interests, its own self. Number two, in so far as decline of the United States is concerned, I think this is more perceived than real. In fact, today, if you see, the revival of growth in the US economy is much, much more robust than what it is in the European Union and the Eurozone countries. Unemployment is down, rates of growth are up, whereas in the case of the
So why are the Japanese talking about American decline then?
And no, this is a general perception, and I think this has also been played up essentially because of the very forward position that the Americans took on Afghanistan, on Iraq, and so on, and now the withdrawal, and of course the financial crisis.
My question was in relation to Japan having an active military. It's been rationalized by saying that America is declining and we need to do things
That's
ourselves.
the third point I wanted to make, that irrespective of whether the Americans are ascendant or in decline, every country, including I would imagine Japan would want to be in a position to defend itself. You would not want to be dependent upon some other country. Recently, during the visit of Obama to Japan, he had pledged support on Senkaku. But to what extent that support would go and in what form it would manifest itself is a question mark. And for Japan not to be able to defend what it perceives as its own interest, we may agree, we may disagree, that's a different matter. But if there is a dispute, naturally, any country, and we are seeing this in the case of the Chinese vis-a-vis India also, we very strongly disagree on the positions that they take on territorial and other issues vis-a-vis India. But the Chinese do not relent. They think that they must have the capability to defend what they consider to be their interests.
Okay. So, Brij, do you think this current reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution is of a piece with the decision taken by Abe in April this year to lift the 4-decade-old ban on Japanese defense exports?
Yes, I think in a way it's linked, obviously. I think to my mind, the important thing is that Abe, when he talks about autonomous defense, or actually doesn't really use the word autonomous defense, it's always linked to America. For instance, if you go back to his grandfather, he actually did think, even though he was the great supporter of the American alliance, he actually thought of a sort of autonomous place for Japan. He supported Arab nationalism. He had a foreign policy perspective which was global. Abe doesn't seem to have that. He still seemed to, and I think that is the problem. So when he's talking about increasing Japan's ability to defend itself, I think he's obfuscating the issue because Japan has that ability.
I was on defense exports. So defense exports up to now, I mean, it's not as if Japan doesn't have a defense industry. It has a pretty robust defense industry, but supplying only the self-defense forces. But now you link yourself globally, do burden sharing, and develop state-of-the-art technology like the F-35 project or missile development, etc.
Well, they've been doing this with the Americans for quite some time now in terms of technological development. And now certainly their economy would benefit greatly if they can open up defense exports.
So Raj, so do you think in days to come we might see Japan exporting not only military hardware, naval vessels to Vietnam and Philippines and other allies, but also actually sending its army there to defend common adversary, that is China?
No, the army is a bit too far. I mean, I think at this point, it is how do you strengthen others who are facing the same problem vis-a-vis China. And after all, it's also not a surprise that India is talking to them about buying amphibious aircraft from the Japanese. So I think it is the first step. I mean, that look, with Australians are talking about buying Japanese submarine technology. So I think there's a long process here. So that I think in the coming years, I think it's a welcome step, more the merrier when they're supplying arms, that we have one more option to actually reach out to someone whose technology is pretty good on the defense side. So I think a Japan that opens its defense technology to friends and partners, I think should be welcome.
So pacifism and exporting arms goes hand in hand, I suppose, because Sweden, one of the most peaceful countries, has one of the most robust arms export industry. And Japan wants to become like that?
Well, it seems so. But I think, you know, one of the things you should consider is Japan has a declining population. Its schools have been closed down. And the same thing is happening with its defense forces. There are fewer recruits coming in. So, you know, they're going to face a manpower problem there.
Better equipment, but no manpower.
Yeah, I mean, you look at South Korea, you look at Taiwan, you look at Japan. The birth rate is declined.
Yeah. Let's talk about what this means for India. Raj pointed to India actually importing this Shinmeva US-2 amphibious aircraft from Japan. So do you see Japan investing more in defense production in India or exporting more defense equipment to India? And what does the change in Japan's posture mean for India? I mean, this is a question to all of you. So let's begin with you, Ranga.
Well, I think insofar as Japan is concerned, it is already looking at India as a partner in a way in which it did not look at India in past years. So far as investment is concerned, this is also a priority for the government of India, the new government on the economic side, and hopefully certainly drawing in technology, investment, etc.
Defense technology, I'm talking
Japan,
about.
yes. And in order for India to be able to develop its own indigenous defense industry, it's very necessary that both in terms of funds and technology, we should have inputs from partners and friends like Japan.
Okay.
But at the same time, we should be clear. Japan does not support India insofar as our territorial disputes are concerned.
Okay. Brij, what do you have to say?
Well, I think I generally agree with that, that there is already, the Japanese are interested in increasing their economic activities here, particularly in infrastructure projects. Our new government seems to want to import arms, so there is some
How does the
synergy.
defense posture change affect us? Forget other investment.
Well, I think my view is that I think Japan doesn't really see us as an alternative, as a hedging bet against China.
Okay.
One.
I think a strong Japan, a Japan that is self-assured, would help construct a more stable balance of power in Asia. We have no historical quarrel with Japan. And I think Nehru always said, look, we can't isolate Japan, just as he said we can't isolate China. So I think a strong Japan, a Japan that is capable militarily, will help construct a multipolar Asian order.
So therefore, a trilateral...
No, it's not just trilateral, it's bilateral. I would emphasize the bilateral more than the trilateral. Trilateral is just a diplomatic thing at this point. There's very little
Even the
going on.
bilateral exercises would have more meaning if Japanese forces can actually
Look,
go
I
out
think there
and
is
fight.
a lot we can do bilaterally. Look, there is a trilateral diplomats meet, but in terms of some occasional naval exercises, but it is in the bilateral that I think Japan can make a significant difference to us.
And this change in posture makes that difference, a
I think we
positive
should
difference.
welcome it.
All right. So you all think we should welcome it?
I certainly think so.
Well, I'm doubtful of this, as I think it's a problem which will create problems in the region more than it will help to solve them.
Okay. On that divided note, we've run out of time. I thank all my guests for coming here and analyzing the situation for us. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.